You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 140 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. This week, I'm happy to be sharing a conversation with a podcast listener, Aimee, who emailed us a few months ago. I read Aimee's email and played a few of her music suggestions on episode 134. And in her email, she mentioned being a sex and love addict and working the program of SLAA. Since many members of SAA do identify as love addicts, I thought it was really important to hear about her experience with love addiction as well as sex addiction. I still hope to do an episode with a panel discussion with the various S fellowships someday. This was mentioned by a listener a while ago, but I have not been able to schedule a recording yet. But yes, it is still something at the back of my mind for an episode in the future. Because this is an SAA podcast, I wanted to pick a few readings for this episode from the SAA Green Book, as well as some outside information on love addiction before getting to the recording. And the first reading comes from page 73 of the Green Book in the section on outside help. And it says, "For some of us, sex is not our only addiction. We may have come to SAA from another recovery program, or we may discover in the course of working our program in SAA that our lives are unmanageable in other areas as well. We might find that we need more support for our other issues and behaviors than SAA alone can provide. Although we are not affiliated with and do not endorse any other 12-step fellowship, we acknowledge our common roots in the steps and traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous as they are practiced in AA and other 12-step programs. Open meetings of other 12-step fellowships and the literature they offer are always available as resources." And I wanted to also do a reading on Tradition 10, and this comes from page 93, and I've read this section on several episodes of the podcast. Down towards the bottom of the page, SAA has no opinion on other 12-step programs for sexual addiction or in general, treatment centers, therapy and its various schools and methods, sexual abuse and its causes, the medical definition of disease and recovery, sex crimes legislation or policy, or the sex scandals of public figures. We neither endorse nor oppose any point of view or organization. As a fellowship, it's simply none of our business. By confining our public statements to matters pertaining to the SAA program of recovery, we keep our fellowship free from unnecessary and possibly dangerous distractions. The 10th tradition does not mean that as individuals we can't have or express opinions on outside issues. Our right to think and believe as we choose is absolute. However, we take care when making any pronouncements on outside issues within the SAA meeting itself. And there is more there to that tradition, but I did want to preface that on this episode of the podcast, since we are going to be talking about the program of Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, SLAA. So that being said, although I do own a copy of the book Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, wishing not to cross the line in Tradition 10, I have chosen to read a brief overview on love addiction that I found on Google. And it says, Symptoms of Love Addiction. Love addiction looks a little different from person to person. The most commonly identifiable symptom of love addiction is an unhealthy fixation on another person that causes obsessive compulsions, such as calling them too frequently, attempting to control them, or even stalking them. This makes creating and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships especially difficult for people with love addiction. Other ways love addiction can manifest include feeling lost or uprooted without a partner, feeling overly dependent on the partner, prioritizing the relationship with a partner over family and friends, becoming depressed and obsessed with a love interest when romantic advances aren't reciprocated, constantly seeking romantic relationships regardless of quality, feeling despondent without a romantic partner or relationship, having difficulty leaving unhealthy or toxic relationships, making poor decisions based on emotions felt toward a partner or love interest, and obsessively thinking of the other person to the point of disruption. So I did want to mention this before turning it over to my conversation with Aimee. And as we were beginning to record, we were in the middle of talking about how some of the S fellowships differ from each other. And now I am ready to turn it over to my conversation with Aimee. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. So the difference between SA and SAA?
Yeah.
Yeah, so SA, and again, I don't speak for them, has a universal definition of abstinence. So everyone in the program has the same requirement for abstinence. With SAA, we have our inner, middle, and outer circle behaviors. And I believe in SLAA, it's what, bottom line behaviors?
Yeah, although I do use the circles diagram because I think my original sponsor that I had, like when I first came in, I think that her background was more in SAA.
Okay.
So she had me make the circle diagram right away, and I still use it just because it hit me at that moment when I was new. And so I just feel like it's a powerful image.
Awesome. So, yeah, I want to do a quick formal introduction so that we have Aimee here on the podcast. And Aimee emailed us a few weeks ago with some musical suggestions, Sinead O'Connor and Renee Rapp. And I was really grateful to be able to play those on the podcast. And I'm sure we'll talk about music in a little while here, but welcome to the podcast, Aimee.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so you are in Chicago?
Yeah.
Awesome. And reading your email, and this is why we started off the way we did, is that you are in SLAA. And how did you find the podcast? I think I read it on the email, but I wanted to be sure.
I look for 12-step podcasts in general, and then there really aren't any that have to do with SLAA. But there's another one. I don't know if I can name it or not. The Daily Reprieve has a lot of speakers, and I don't know if that's SA or SAA. Yeah, and then this one. I think those are the main two. So I was listening to the Daily Reprieve a lot, and all the S-type content is very male-dominated. And so I would look through and try to find any female names and listen. Mainly because even like myself, when I came into SLAA, my initial thought was, well, I'm not a sex addict, I'm a love addict. And I think a lot of women feel like that's the situation. But over time, I was in denial about some things. And then I also realized that my brain doesn't even know the difference between sex and love. So it's all the same.
How would you describe love addiction? Because we've had a few guests on the podcast that do identify as love addicts, but we primarily talked about the sex addiction component. So what do you see as being love addicted?
Well, there's actually a book that's kind of famous. It's by Mellody, and it's called Love Addiction. So I think that sort of is like the origin of that term, or it's kind of like foundational literature for the idea. So even outside of the 12-step model, any 12-step program, the idea of love addiction, she has like diagrams in there where there's like different addictive cycles that you go through in a relationship. I think for me, like in SLAA, my bottom lines or inner circle behaviors are romantic obsession and then unsafe or anonymous sexual encounters. And so to answer your question about love addiction, I think that sort of like romantic obsessive attachment to somebody, to me, that's love addiction.
Okay. And then, the anonymous hookups and stuff would be more of the sex addiction.
Yeah, except that the more recovery, like the more I finally got involved in recovery and really started opening up some of the wounds, I realized that it's just like, it's such a complex disease. And I think it's especially complicated for women, although obviously sex and love are complicated for everybody, not just women. But I had sort of like a binary idea in my mind. So I've gone through different periods in my life where my sex and love addiction manifested itself in different ways. So I definitely had periods where I was being promiscuous and even like pretty much self-destructive or like engaging in activities that amounted to self-harm. And so to me, I would think that is sex addict behavior. But then I realized, like, even when I'm in a romantic relationship, I have a lot of sex addiction that goes on. So I'm never sure if I'm getting enough sex or having the right kind of sex, or, are we having too much sex or not enough sex? Or, I just had like this endless rumination in my mind. And then thinking about some of the relationships where I felt like romantic obsession. Like for me, the romantic obsession is mostly with relationships that I can't leave, which is one of the SLAA characteristics. We stay in and return to painful relationships, painful, destructive relationships. So a few different times in my life, I just had really like completely lost my mind over a breakup, and I just could not get past that partner. And so that's where my obsession manifests itself. And the one that kind of brought my rock bottom situation that finally brought me into the program, I think it was like the perfect storm of love addiction and sex addiction, because there was a very strong sexual, really like connection. And so I think that's why it really brought me into my final rock bottom moment, because I felt like there was a psychological relationship and a sexual relationship. So I think I had spent my whole life keeping those things separate.
And how long ago was that?
That was in, I would say, the spring of 2023.
Okay. Wow. So relatively new.
Yeah, I haven't been in very long. I mean, to me, it feels like a long time, but I've been living with the effects of being a sex and love addict my whole life. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure how are you going to, do you have like structured interview questions, or do you want me to just babble?
Babble. Yeah. It's is pretty much a free form conversation. The only one that I really have pre-planned is talking about the inner, middle, and outer circle. And we were starting to talk about that a little bit before we started recording, that your sponsor did have you go through the three circles as a model. And so you did talk about a couple of inner circle behaviors. And I don't know if you have other inner circles that you can share, or if you want to move to some other circles.
Well, when I entered the program, I kind of floundered around for a while. So I was doing a lot of different meetings and reading literature. And then I went through a couple attempts to have a sponsor. So I didn't get like a consistent good sponsor until December. And they, at this in-person group that I go to, or at this in-person meeting, they do sponsorship through the AA Big Book, which is slightly different than, so they have like a whole, it's very drawn out, but I love it because it's very thorough. So I had to write out my first step, and then there's all these questions to answer for your second step. It's a slow process. But I've kept the circles because it really stuck with me, because when I was in the depths of despair, my first temporary sponsor had me make the circles diagram. Okay. So from that moment, it was romantic obsession and, like I said, unsafe or anonymous sexual encounters. And then adding to that, so at that time, it was like, do not have any contact with the qualifier, like the man that I was obsessing over, and stop having sex, right? And then with my current, more permanent sponsor, it's just an agreement not to have sex or date. It's no dating, no sex, and no sex with self or masturbation until at least step 9.
Oh, wow.
And so that's my sort of my sobriety plan. That's how I think of it.
That's pretty impressive.
Well, I floundered around a lot because
Yeah.
they kind of set the bar kind of high for the sobriety. So it took me a while to get a 30-day sobriety chip. But
Hmm.
for my
Yeah.
bottom lines, I was saying like I think I flip-flopped a lot. And so I would like jump from one side of my addiction to another. So if I was in a relationship and having a lot of emotional turmoil, then I would go through a period of just having a lot of hookup anonymous sex
Hmm.
because it felt like a relief to me because I had so much turmoil whenever I tried to have a quote unquote real relationship. It caused me so much angst because I had all this stuff going on in my head that it just seemed easier, to just have casual sex. But then
Hmm.
that would seem like it was sort of self-destructive as well.
Yeah, I identify as both a sex addict and an intimacy avoidant. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you were talking about kind of going back and forth between the two, for me, I definitely have the intimacy avoidance and just the fears that come up. And so
Mm-hmm.
that leads me to want to act out where I don't have to be vulnerable. And
Mm-hmm.
so I go to that extreme, and then that I know isn't great. And so especially in my relationship, so just looking at ways that I can lessen some of the anxieties and fears that I have around intimacy and try to cultivate a healthier relationship. So the acting out with pornography for me is a way for me to escape those fears, but it's also a way for me to avoid having to be vulnerable. And so, yeah, I constantly go back and forth.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've learned so far in recovery is that I actually have a fear of intimacy, which I
Mm,
had no idea. I had no idea. I thought, I mean, I was in the past, I was married and I've had plenty of relationships that I thought were intimate. And I've always been living in this world where I was hoping to have an intimate relationship and maybe get married again and have a partner. But I think my pattern of chasing emotionally unavailable men
hmm.
for casual sex, those are just things that make me avoid intimacy. So there's also an SLAA characteristic about that, that
Hmm.
we avoid responsibility for ourselves by attaching to unavailable people. And I kind of figured it out for myself that my penchant for casual hookups was some sort of anorexia on my part
Hmm.
because I was really just because there's no intimacy there. Or if there is, it's like a sort of a faux fleeting intimacy. Like I used to tell myself that I liked the idea of like two strangers just connecting in a brief and
Hmm.
limited way. It almost seemed romantic to me, but it doesn't seem that way anymore.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, some of the behaviors that you were mentioning, I've got a friend on social media talking about the toxic relationships and keep coming back to someone. I know she's like right in the middle of that, and I reached out and said, I'm an addict in recovery. If you're open and willing, I can share more information. So far, she hasn't reached out, but
Mm.
it's not my place to say, hey, you belong in this program. But I recognize so many of the behaviors, so many of the thought patterns, and things that she's going through as she posts, and so it's like, yeah, I recognize that, and I've heard those stories over and over again, and hoping that she finds a room or finds someone that will offer her a place of hope.
Yeah. When I hit my rock bottom, I was suicidal over the situation, not even over that particular person, but I felt like I was losing my mind because in true addict form, I could not understand why I was doing the things I was doing or
Hmm.
why I couldn't stop. And so I really acted like a crazy person. So, I mean, the relationship was not satisfying and I kept breaking up and leaving. And then
Hmm.
I would go back to him. And then I would leave and I would get mad and leave and then go back. And every time he just took me back, but I mean, he got tired of it. And I just kept getting more and more unhappy. And I felt like not even because of him as a person, but I was in such despair over the pattern that I was seeing in myself. Like the mental obsession, like it really was exactly like an addiction to a substance. Like I want to quit, but I can't. And the hit, I'm not getting high. I'm not getting a high off of seeing him anymore. And so it's like, it's not working. Like the drug is not working. And so I just felt so much despair that I thought there's no point in going on. And then it took me I was with that person for a year, and it took me like a whole another year of back and forth. And in between, I would act out with strangers. So I was on the dating apps, I was trying to date, I was having hookup sex, anything to like keep my mind off of my obsession object. And so it became like this cycle, an endless cycle. And then I would hook up with somebody, and then I would boomerang back because I missed the qualifier. And so I just had myself on this insane roller coaster. And all of this was happening in the background while I was also working on my career and being a single mother. I just was like making myself insane. And that's another one of my lifelong patterns, is leading a double life. And that's one of the reasons why I like a lot of the SA and SAA speaker shares and podcasts, because some women in program, there are a lot of Zoom meetings and in-person meetings that are women only. But I've been taught to look for the similarities, not the differences, number one. And number two, I identify with men in a lot of ways, especially the men who, like, what really resonated for me is the double life. So it would be somebody that looks like an upstanding citizen, is a good dad and, a good father and husband, and he's a deacon at the church. But then, like, in secret, he has like a pornography addiction, or he's visiting prostitutes, or, whatever his issue is. And that's how I've been for a long time. So when I was married, I was unfaithful. So the idea of like sneaking around is part of my pattern. And that's something I'm still unpacking. But after I got divorced and I was with the kids, I just didn't really involve any of my romantic interests with my children. So I had this one life, but then when they were gone visiting their dad, I had a whole separate life, which seemed fine to me. And now trying to integrate my life has been really challenging.
Yeah. There comes a point where I know for myself that I hit a wall, and just trying to keep the two halves separate was crazy making. I just, I could not handle it. And I can remember sitting next to a couch and crying, and just knowing that I'm acting one way in the day and one way at night, and nothing is changing. And so something's got to change, is I can't keep it up. And the longer I would go, and especially like my sleep, I would stay up till the early hours of the morning, and then just not getting enough sleep over and over. It just got to a point where the two halves of my life, I couldn't find any sanity in that. And trying to reconcile that, something's got to give. And then I think it happened at least once before I got into program, but there were a couple of times where I really recognized it. And but yeah, just trying to live that life of integrity, and not having it was just so difficult and so crazy making, that something had to give. And that's where I found program.
I'm really happy that you did, because another part of my story is that one of the reasons that I got divorced, one of the straws that broke the camel's back, was that I found out that my husband had a pornography addiction. And so there was a lot of, and, I was unfaithful in the marriage, but there was also situations where I think he was sexually anorexic, so we weren't having sex. And then I felt abandoned and neglected. And so, I would act out. But to find out that he was like, watching porn for like 8 hours a day, and not having sex with his wife, I thought it was just a lot for me. And before I was in SLAA, I was in ACA for quite a while. And so there's always been a lot of addiction around me. And I developed this idea, like the way that I was navigating the world was that I understand what addiction is, and it's a thing that I don't have. Right. So it's a thing that happens to everybody else. Oh, my parents are alcoholics. My ex-boyfriend was a heroin addict. My friend is in rehab. And then with my ex-husband, I decided that he was a porn addict, and I strongly suspect that he could qualify for DA, Debtors Anonymous, because the divorce was around what really caused the divorce was that he just was doing all kinds of weird spending and having secret debt and all this like secrecy. And so, I went through life just on my high horse thinking that everybody else was an addict and not me. And then when it finally dawned on me after I had enough serenity in the rest of my life, it was obvious that when I wasn't dating. And then when I started dating, it was so obvious that, everything fell apart as soon as I started interacting with men. And so I don't even remember how I found SLAA, but when I read those characteristics, I was like thunderstruck. I said, oh my gosh, that's me. I do all of those things, every single one. So
yeah. I tend like to a sense of relief knowing that others are out there with the same type of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I love the "You are not alone." It's on the chips and on a lot of the literature. Because I just used to feel so alone, and getting to the point where you can laugh about things that used to make you cry, is great. I'm not sure what else you want me to talk about, but one anecdote that I like to share is that in my first few months, I was listening to all sorts of AA podcasts and every kind of addiction podcast I could. And like I said, there's a lot of alcoholism in my family. I have some food issues myself as well, but I haven't worked the food program. And I was listening to these AA stories where you hear about, like, it's kind of a trope that you hear stories about someone getting drunk and waking up in bed with someone they don't remember how they, how did they get home from the bar with this stranger? And a lot of women in AA and NA, that's intertwined with their story because their addiction brings them into contact with all sorts of unhealthy sexual relationships and sexual behaviors. And so then they will figure out that once they get through the one addiction, they realize that they also have a sex and love addiction. But for me, what I thought was really comical realization is that you have alcoholics that are drinking and wake up next to a stranger because they're in their addiction. They're in the throes of their addiction. And I'm a dyed-in-the-wool sex and love addict. And so I don't drink very often, but a pattern for me would be I'm in the throes of my sex and love addiction. And so I wake up with a bottle in my bed because when I'm in the throes of my sex and love addiction, I tend to drink more alcohol and get dysregulated with my food and do all sorts of other things like over exercise, overwork. I just, my whole system is very unstable and I'm trying to do all these things. I'm floundering around trying to keep myself in some sort of stasis. And so, because I remember on my rock bottom night that I was just like I found a bottle of something that was left over from Christmas that was up on top of my fridge. And I just didn't know what else to do with myself. And I was just like swigging like whiskey, and I'm not much of a drinker. And I just like didn't know what else to do.
When you're mentioning, alcoholics finding their way into sexual situations, one of my friends, Arlena, has a podcast. She's renamed it a bunch of times. Used to be the ODAT chat, One Day at a Time. And I think right now it's the One Day at a Time podcast. But I used to listen to that, and I had known her for years. her husband I've known since we were kids, and he's my best friend's sponsor in AA. So I started listening to her podcast and hearing a lot of the recovery stories. I did hear a lot of women that ended up in SLAA, and hearing that, I offered to be a guest on her podcast. And this is when I had just been toying with the idea of making this podcast.
Mm.
And so one of the things when I came up with the idea is I wasn't sure if this was going to be my personal podcast or if we were going to do it as I brought it to my intergroup for my SAA meetings. And so this is officially run by the San Francisco Bay Area intergroup. And so
Oh.
it is an SAA podcast. And that's why I focus everything on SAA. But if I did it on my own, I would have to pay out of my own pocket, but I could talk about kind of whatever I wanted. But it was really the idea of the podcast was right when I was a guest on hers. And when I had mentioned it, she's like, you realize now that you've mentioned it on this podcast, you have to make this happen. And I'm just like, oh shit. So her podcast really got the ball rolling for me to get this one launched because it had been an idea of mine for years. And we finally got the ball rolling after I did that interview. And once it was posted and out there live, I was just like, oh man, I've got to really commit to making this. But it was through listening to other addicts. I love a lot of the other recovery podcasts that are out there, but I don't identify with drinking and taking drugs. And so I was wanting to hear more sex addicts talk about what's going on for them. A lot of the recovery, the 12-step work is the same, but the identifications and some of the idiosyncratic behaviors that we have are different than drinkers. And so that was the nature of how we started this one.
One of my favorite speakers. So I'm always looking for content around romantic obsession. And I think people don't talk about it as much, and it's hard to have it as a bottom line because how do you define it? Yeah. And so I call it mental masturbation because I feel like the things that torture me most are what's going on inside my head. And that's a pattern that I've had since childhood. Like I developed this ability to fantasize and split off. And so even as a little kid, I would fantasize about like having a boyfriend, or I would fantasize about little boys in my class. Like, what if they were my boyfriend? And so I like immediately built those neural pathways that I could self-soothe or cope with boredom by just creating these things in my head and fixating on another person and hoping and wishing and, all these things. And so I still do that. And it's actually one of the most toxic parts of my addiction. So I even now will think about my qualifier. So I'm not really plagued with, I don't have intrusive thoughts about random sex acts or, random people or other things, but the objects of my obsession, they're worms in my brain. And so, and I can even track, if I have a really stressful day at work, my brain will start telling me without connecting them consciously, my brain will, or like if I'm upset about something with the kids and their dad and there's an argument, my brain doesn't want to think about what's actually stressing me out. My brain will start thinking, well, remember that time that you had an argument back in 2023, and let's just relive that argument. And if we hadn't had that argument, maybe we do belong together. We're just anything about that relationship, my brain wants to latch onto it. And so it just can't let go, it's like a pit bull. It just, it never. And so one thing that I thought was really powerful in a different podcast, I heard about a man was telling his story, and whatever his acting out, I don't know if it was masturbation or pornography or both, but his lustful thoughts, his coping mechanism was the same thing. He had stuff going on inside his head like I do. And he decided that whenever he had a lustful thought, he would get on his knees and pray. And so it turned into a situation where it became like a sort of a challenge for him, because if he started to have a lustful thought, he had to figure out, how can I get on my knees? So in the workplace and at home, he would like figure out a way to act like he was doing something and just get on his knees.
Yeah.
Like at home, he might just, all of a sudden start scrubbing the floor or something or whatever. But he talked about the physicality of doing that with his body to interrupt his mind. And so that struck me, because around the same time I had figured out that like I was exploring prayer and higher power and like asking God to help me with my obsession. And then I'm Catholic. And so I found that I could interrupt my thought, like a way to add to that, because if you're already having something going on inside your head and then your prayer is also largely inside your head, that's kind of like fighting fire with fire or something. So if I start doing like the Catholic sign of the cross, like you would in church, adding the physicality to it and just the touching, because, there's like, they do like tapping in therapy. And so I really related with the man that was physically kneeling in order to interrupt his thoughts. And so for me, like doing this while I pray has been powerful. So, and I work from home, so there's often no reason that I can't do that. So yeah, something I would love to, if anyone ever wanted to talk about strategies, like the hell that is dealing with thoughts inside your head and strategies to interrupt them. Because you can do whatever you want to, like, theoretically, I have all sorts of things I could do to distract myself. But the problem is, it doesn't work. They don't work. You know what I mean? Like once it's in your head, it's in your head. So I can go for a run or go scrub the bathtub or do something productive, but my brain is still doing that. It's still in my brain.
Yeah. A friend of mine who was actually on the podcast, we did an episode after one of our retreats, and we did a panel discussion on women's experiences at the retreat. And one of my friends, she's blind. And so she always has thoughts in her head. She talked about it there, and just the difficulties of trying to get beyond that is, amazingly difficult. So those physical actions is really important. I know for me, when I first did my third step, my sponsor and I did it before our home meeting, and we had the chance to get down on our knees and do the prayer. And I don't do that all that often, get down on my knees, the kneeling, but there is something about that physical action that just completely changes it. So I'm not just reciting it in my head, I'm actually doing that. And this is the way I had done my morning prayers for years. I would roll out of bed and get on my knees, do my prayers, and then go about my day. So yeah, there is something to that physicality.
I have a little chair that I kneel before to do my morning prayers, and I usually do like a prayer journal just because I'm kind of journal oriented. So, and then there's also the 12-step practice of two-way prayer. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's basically just listening to God, and there's some different writings and podcasts about it. It stems from the original Oxford group, which was the precursor to the Bill W. Yeah. So it's just, you're not just talking at God, you sort of meditate and pose a question and then wait for God to speak to you. And so what I write down, you write down your question, but then you also write down what God's answer was. So if different things pop into your mind, and I've been to a workshop where we did that. It wasn't coined two-way prayer, but it is definitely that, of posing the question and also writing down what you hear. Yeah, it sounds silly, but it's been incredibly powerful for me.
Yeah, it's awesome.
I mean, I don't think it sounds silly now. But to someone who hasn't done it, they might think it sounds silly.
Yeah. Yeah, a friend of mine has led a workshop multiple times on doing the fourth step in that way and just closing your eyes. And I forget if it was fears or resentments that he was working on, but just take a couple seconds, do a prayer, and then listen, and then write down whatever is there. And it was a really cool way of approaching the fourth step inventory, and just not putting thought into it, but putting prayer into it. And it was a really cool exercise.
Yeah. And I'm only on step 2, but in the course of step 1, where I had to write out my whole story.
Yeah.
Like one thing that is already apparent, I have all these notes for when I get to step 4, because after I gained some sobriety, I'd been thinking of myself as a victim, but I was also wallowing in all sorts of ego and resentment. And over time, I feel completely horrible about some of the things that I've done that hurt other people. So when I started writing out my first step story about my entire history of, romantic and sexual interactions, I got like profoundly depressed. So I spent, like the song that I sent you, the Renee Rapp song, it says, "I'll make it through the winter if it kills me." Like I spent all of last winter, I felt it got really cold here in Chicago. In like January and February, it was like 20 below zero for like a month. And it just, I was schlepping around in the same pair of jeans and wool sweater like all the time. I could barely function because I was just under the weight of all the mistakes that I made and all the ways in which I hurt people that tried to love me. And then realizing that I created this endless quest for love and sex, which is one of the characteristics. Like we compulsively pursue, additional interactions. So I was never happy with whatever was in front of me. I was always looking for something else. So whether I was cheating on my husband or just constantly telling him that he was inadequate because I wasn't happy, or later, just dating people and not really caring if they had feelings for me. So just there's like a lot of things where I just was like incredibly self-centered and self-absorbed. So
yeah.
Once you start realizing it, it sucks.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to know, like, who wants to find out what kind of a crappy person you actually are.
Yeah. I did my step work right out of the big book of AA, and it was all looking at all those negative things about ourselves. And so in SAA, we use the green book, which is Sex Addicts Anonymous. And in the fourth step there, it's really cool. It talks about character assets and positive attributes. So when we were doing the steps in a group and we were focusing like 3 weeks in a row on the negative aspects of ourselves, and it's like, okay, today we're going to flip the script and look at some positive aspects of ourselves. And that's what I like about some of the more modern, younger 12-step programs. I'm super grateful for Bill W. and the 12 steps of AA, but a lot of that stuff is antiquated, and just being able to look at countermeasures to keep us from feeling completely shitty about ourselves is a really nice thing to be able to do.
Is that sort of like top line behaviors?
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about outer circle or top line healthy behaviors. And, I know that you had mentioned both the Renee Rapp and the Sinead O'Connor. And in the email, you had mentioned that you enjoyed that I share music on the podcast. And so, I find being a non-religious person trying to find a higher power, I've always had this connection with music. And so my higher power speaks to me through music. And when I started talking about that on the podcast and sharing stuff, I get the stuff, emails from listeners like yourself and getting turned on to new music and stuff. So is that something that you turn to, music?
Well, I do, but also it's more of a trigger. So it's one of my middle circle, intoxicating music.
Gotcha.
So I've heard of women in particular they have a problem with maybe like romantic books or romantic movies that really stimulate their fantasy and stuff. And for me, like pop music can be pretty triggering. Like any kind of music that's about love or
and there's
that,
plenty.
yeah, most of them are. And then other things even that seem empowering can also sort of trigger my addiction, because if it's some very empowered female singer that's talking about, I dumped this guy and I don't need him and I feel great, anything that has to do with like that kind of would make me feel a little bit intoxicated too, because it speaks to the roller coaster, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I stay away from that. But in my top lines, in my outer circle, I do have fiction and instrumental music, because like literature and music are a really important part of life overall. I just need to not worry about, I don't need to hear like about a woman who's had her heart broken.
Yeah, yeah.
There's plenty of other music and plenty of other songs that aren't about that. And then so mine are all kind of maybe a little bit abstract.
Yeah.
So my middle circle, things that put me off kilter are overwork. So because I tend to be workaholic. There's something that I call substance misuse. So because I'm an addict inside. So if I have a headache, I need to take 2 Advil, not 6. And, if I'm having a glass of wine at dinner, I need to have 1 glass and not 6. And the same thing goes with like caffeine and chocolate and other sort of like substances. Just making sure that I do everything in a normal way and according to whatever instructions there are. Because if I don't, it gets me in touch with my inner addict. So if I eat potato chips and cake for lunch, that starts me down a path of like being neglectful and hedonistic. And it's just the first step on a yellow brick road that leads to me being hedonistic and self-neglectful, in more destructive ways. So all that stuff, and anything that makes me overtired. So, like overwork, because I get myself and over exercising as well. So anything where I'm like overdoing things basically. And then my top line activities are also kind of abstract, but like I said, fiction / literature, instrumental music. Then some other things like, so self-care, healthy exercise, healthy socializing. Obviously, like going on a date with a guy and calling it socializing is not the same thing. I put in like family care. So anything where I'm doing things with my daughters or taking care of my mother. Home care, which is just like cleaning house or, doing something to take care of the home. It doesn't have to be much. And I never make it through the list, but my goal is that if I could have a day where I engaged in every single top line activity all in a row, that would be great. But usually the days are, there's not enough time to do everything.
Yeah.
Another one that I have on my top lines, I just call it fiscal sobriety. So, obviously that means paying attention to my bills and paying attention to how much money's in the bank. But also, I will give myself a check mark on that if I do something like take some time on my lunch break to call and see if I can get cheaper insurance. That's fiscally sober. Like I called 2023 my lost year because I was spiraling out of control between my love addiction and my sexual acting out. And in that year, I had 3 different insurance claims on my car and my auto insurance skyrocketed. And I also did a bunch of goofy stuff with money. So, I let some bills pile up and I just was not on top of things because I was in my addiction acting crazy. So even little things like making sure that I, like I said, call about the insurance, or making sure that I called, like most recently, I lost my debit card when I was traveling for work. And my inclination was to not kind of had to make myself call and report it stolen, because as soon as I figured out that I could still spend money out of my account using PayPal or Zelle or, like where it was already loaded, I was ordering groceries, I was ordering food. It wasn't until like, I needed to get gas in the car and I didn't have my card. And I realized, oh my gosh, I have to go to the bank and ask them to give me like money in cash.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally did the work of reporting the old debit card lost. I'm sure that was kind of a long story, but the point is, in the midst of my recovery, that I would put that off. It's an incredibly unsober thing to do, right? Because a normal person, that shows my capacity for denial. A normal person would immediately be like, oh my goodness, I lost my debit card. And I'm just like, oh my God, I have to deal with that. Like, this is annoying, and let's ignore it, And so my debit card could be at the Washington, D.C., Reagan National Airport, and everyone could be using it. But it didn't cross my mind to act immediately on that. So
yeah. For me, when I got to step 4 is when I really recognized some of those behaviors, the fears that were tied to me being proactive with my finances and stuff. There were times, I had the money to pay my bills, but instead of paying it, I just would shove it off to the side. And that would in turn cause extra anxiety that would come back to haunt me later. But instead of dealing with it, I just kept pushing it off to the side and kind of getting through that step, and then on through steps 5, 6, and 7. It's like, oh shit, I need to be proactive about this stuff and stay on top of it. And the more I'm able to stay on top of it, the easier it is for me to just keep moving forward. But yeah.
Do you have more structured? Oh, are we at our time?
We're coming pretty close. So we are just under an hour. Usually what I ask towards the end is if there were other things that you wanted to cover that we haven't already talked about.
I think I covered kind of the things that I wanted to get out into our collective stream of consciousness, like just the idea about the romantic obsession.
Yeah.
And the casual hooking up and figuring out that they were all part of the same pattern.
Yeah.
And like, I think that, again, I don't want to say for sure how men think about things, but I think for women, there's a whole layer of just the things that society tells us. Like, it's very easy. Like there's the Disney, like I can't watch like there's probably no Disney movie that I could watch that doesn't trigger some sort of like love addiction, romantic fantasy.
Totally.
Like they put that in our minds from when we're little. And then they also put all these mixed messages, society has all these mixed messages about sex and sexuality and the need to be sexy, but the need to be chaste. And then later you realize that, you're supposed to be empowered sexually. And so it's just really hard for women and probably men as well. But just to even really like in the society that we live in, it's really hard for us as humans to even know for sure what we want and why we want it, right? Because we're so bombarded with all of these different messages about what we should want and what we should be doing. And in 12-step, we know about shoulding, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that seems like a good note to end on, I guess.
Yeah. So I'm so grateful that you reached out. In your email, you did talk about finding women's stories, and I'll let you know that I've got a list of the stories. Eventually, once I get a web designer that is fluent in WordPress, we're going to be looking at finding ways to be able to search for different topics or different experiences in terms of guests on the podcast. And so I've got a list of women guests, LGBTQ stuff. I've got ones that deal with intimacy avoidance, ones that deal with certain steps. So I've got like a bunch of different ways of filtering through all the episodes, because now that we've been around for a couple of years, got quite a few episodes out there. But yeah, I do have a number of episodes with women. I would love to keep getting more. As your email came in, I was just wrapping up an interview with Yale from Israel, and getting to hear her story was awesome. And yeah, she discovered the podcast and had sent me an email too. And so it was really great to be able to connect. All the SAA meetings that I had started off with were mixed meetings, but predominantly, 85-90% men. And so even on episode 2 of the podcast, a couple of my best friends in the program were in that, one being a man, one being a woman. And to be able to hear her experiences was really powerful. But yeah, I hope to continue to share women's stories on the podcast. Yeah, when people email me to hear certain types of stories, COSAs are another, the COSA group, which is kind of our partner program for kind of like what Al-Anon is for AA.
Yeah.
So we've got a number of COSA speakers, and I've got like these little lists of episodes, and I'm hoping to have the spot where people can just go and figure out where all those are. But yeah, I'd be happy to send you a list of all of our women guests that have been on the podcast. And
that would be great. I mean, I think I've listened to all of your episodes at this point.
Okay.
So
yeah,
I went through a period when I was in early recovery where I just, you're supposed to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. I was trying to do that. And then also I was just bombarding myself with podcasts. So.
Yep. A lot of people will use the podcast episodes as substitutes when they can't get to a meeting. And it's an incredible tool that's out there now for people to be able to do. One of my friends went camping, and he was going to be away from any sort of meeting. And so he downloaded a whole bunch of podcasts to his device because he wasn't going to be anywhere with Wi-Fi. And so he had all those all loaded up so he could listen to them while he was out on the mountain. That was a really good idea.
Yeah, I recently realized that you can download things to your iPhone like the way that you could with it's like an old-fashioned iPod.
Yep.
And then you can listen to them on the airplane. So I did that with some meditations because I started using the Insight timer. And so I was sitting in the airplane listening to just closing my eyes and looking like I was asleep and just listening to different meditations. That's definitely the way to fly. I'm going to do that again.
Nice. Well, I thank you so much for your time and for coming here on the podcast to share about your experiences. It's been a fantastic time.
All right. I don't know if I want to hear myself talk on the podcast, but I'm glad that I was able to be of service.
You're very welcome.
All right. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Aimee.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I had such a wonderful time talking with Aimee, and thank you so much for emailing us, and I'm really glad that we had the chance to record. And I do hope this helps open up communication between the various S fellowships. And because this is an SAA podcast, we do need to stick to the message of Sex Addicts Anonymous. But yeah, I felt it was a very healthy conversation to have. So regarding things that were mentioned in my conversation with Aimee, I will be providing a link to Pia Mellody's book, as well as some general information about SLAA. So look for those in the show notes of this episode. Before closing out this episode, I'm going to be reading some listener feedback emails as well as some comments from the YouTube channel. And I'll be rounding it out with some music that has been part of my recovery over the past month or so. And the songs that I'm going to be focusing on are more of the Nordic folk variety, and especially featuring the voices of women. So we did receive a few emails, and I'm not sure if I read this one on the podcast or not. This came in July, and it was just a short one. And says, I just found your podcast and simply wanted to thank you for your service. It is a great help for me and the world. You're making such a positive impact in the world. Cheers. And thank you so much. And we did have two that came in last week that I wanted to read. And the first one is from the initial J in Rhode Island. And it says, Jason, brother, I can't explain how much I enjoy your podcast. As a guy who has struggled with sex addiction my whole life, since experiencing abuse at the age of 6, this whole world of sex addiction and recovery has been a mystery to me. It's strange to exist and nearly drown in it for over 30 years and still not realize there is hope and there is a path full of incredible people to help until finally hitting a faceplant rock bottom on my 44th birthday. I listen to your podcast in the morning when I'm making breakfast, and it sets me off on the right foot, makes me feel less alone and more confident that sobriety is possible. It's also a great reminder that it is the program, the work, and the fellowship that will keep us sober. I am proud to say that I am 58 days sober today, and I intend to keep that momentum in part from the work and honesty you're putting in here. The reason I'm writing to you, and not for myself, but for a buddy of mine, because I wanted to see if you know of anyone who you can interview that has some kind of physical disability who has obtained a level of sobriety. I heard you talking about how your plan has been to make sure you are creating and sharing a diverse amount of content, and I was curious if there is any information or fellowship related to this topic. One of my accountability partners is a guy in his late teens who has cerebral palsy. I know in many ways he is just a normal guy with wants and needs, goals, and temptations. But I can't help think that some of his struggles in maintaining sobriety have to do with his varying abilities and his own physical limitations. I can't imagine how difficult it must be to remain connected to the world through social media, but be constantly confronted by the negative and triggering world available at his fingertips. How his limited mobility and feelings of separation might also contribute to his addiction. Anyway, I am rambling, and I'm not sure if you have anyone you know who might shed some light on their journey in this way, but thought in the thread of inclusivity, it would be an amazing opportunity to bring this discussion to life. Keep up the incredible work. Thanks for the honesty and the work you are doing to make sure the world understands we are not to be feared, but understood and loved and supported. Sincerely, your brother in sobriety, Jay from Rhode Island. Wow, such an amazing email. Thank you so much. I do know a few people in the program who have different types of disabilities. One person who I haven't seen in a long time was part of the deaf community. He used to show up at our Bay Area retreats, and we had signers help interpret for him. But I haven't seen him in a number of years. We also have sight-impaired people here in the Bay Area. And I do know that there was another guy who was wheelchair-bound. I believe probably had cerebral palsy. I'm not sure if he is still in the fellowship or not. But yes, I am open to any suggestions. Anyone who knows of someone who might be good for the podcast, please send them this way, and I would be happy to interview them. I do really want to open the doors to inclusivity and make sure that we were getting as many different types of stories out there. As far as resources go, I know that there are some out there. I don't have them at the tip of my fingers right now. If I do find any links, I will put them in the show notes. But yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this email. Another email we received on the same day. It says, "Hi, Jason. I hope this email finds you well. I wanted to share how important your podcast has become to me in my recovery journey. I've listened to most of the episodes, some of them more than once. They have become such an important tool for me and often help keep me present and connected through varying moments where I would have struggled. Like some of your guests, I am from the UK and attend 2 weekly meetings in the Brighton area. I've been in program for around 10 months and I'm working step 4 after a rigorous step 1 and finding a higher power, which is now a core part of my recovery every day. I'm currently waiting to be processed through the legal system here in the UK, which is taking its time and has a big burden on life in general. I've been grateful to the fellowship around me and have now done my Step 1 presentation 3 times, which is always met with heartfelt thanks from those who listen and relate to my journey into recovery. The gift of desperation is real. I know that I always give people details of your podcast to help them when they need some support on recovery. I've also recently completed a course called Safer Lives, which is aimed at people who are facing legal impacts because of their behavior, which has helped me massively to unpick a lot of my underlying behaviors and make significant changes for the rest of my life. I know that the time difference often makes talking to people in the UK a challenge, but if you feel there is an opportunity to have a conversation and perhaps for me to share my experience, strength, and hope, I would be very happy to share. Anyway, keep up the amazing work with the podcast. I'm sure you know it helps so many of us across the globe, and it's a great thing you are doing, but also takes up a lot of time and energy. I hope to hear from you sometime. Best regards, M. Yes, and thank you so much. I would love to have you as a guest on the podcast. There is an 8-hour time difference between California and the UK. I have been temporarily sponsoring someone from the UK, and we have found times on the weekends where the time difference is advantageous for both of us. Most of the time during the week when I record is in the evenings here on the West Coast, which is the wee hour mornings in the UK. And thank you so much also for sharing information about the podcast. The podcast is available not only on all major podcasting platforms, but we do also have a link on the UK SAA website, which is saauk.info. And I'll be putting a link to that in the show notes as well. But yeah, congratulations on working on step 4. And I hope you continue to progress through the steps. And after I get this episode published, I will definitely reach out to you and see if there's a time that we can schedule for a recording. On to some YouTube comments. We did get a few. One of them was just people's names, so I don't know if someone was trying to tag other people to be able to view this episode, but that was on episode 67, Teresa D, speaking at the SAA and COSA speaker meeting. Thinking of the speaker meeting, the next couple of episodes will be from our August SAA and COSA speaker meeting, so look forward to those. We also got a comment on episode 137, which is Adi's first step. And it says, "What a great way to write a story. Well structured. Also, thank you for the video." And you're very welcome. Yeah, I had a lot of fun with the creativity involved in doing the sound editing for that episode. And reading Adi's first step, like I mentioned on that episode, was really emotional for me just to read. And I have heard back from Adi, and he really enjoyed it, and we're hoping to find time to connect and be able to talk. And lastly, this one came from our previous episode 139, How Do Areas Delegates and GSRs Work with the SAA Conference? And the comment says, "Thank you for the information. Our local group does not currently have a GSR. Very helpful conversation." Thank you so much. On that episode, I also talked about the fact that SAA has a subreddit, which is reddit.com/r/SEXAA. And there people will post readings from Voices of Recovery. Other people will ask questions looking for advice. I posted information on episode 139 to help clarify some of the questions that may come up about SAA service. And with the October conference coming up so quickly, I wanted to get as much information out there so people can form their area assemblies, elect a delegate, and send their delegate to the conference. So I'll be leaving links to that as well in this episode. Before closing this out, I did want to play a few pieces of music. A lot of the Nordic folk music that has been a part of my recovery process has been really present in my life over the past few months. Several new albums and recordings have been released. I will be talking about Vardruna on another episode. For this episode, I did want to focus more on the female voices and just thinking of Aimee's original email talking about Sinead O'Connor and Renee Rapp and the importance of hearing women's voices in SAA. These ones I thought would be appropriate for this episode. I mentioned in episode 138 that I had been present for a live stream of Heilung's new live ritual that they just released called Lifa Jotengard. And this was their 2021 performance at Red Rocks in Colorado. It was the first time they had played live since the pandemic shut down concerts around the world. It was a really cathartic moment for a lot of people, and I know several people that actually went to that ritual. But to be there for the live stream on YouTube, it was great taking part in the live chat and to be able to connect with other people around the world in this way. On episode 70 of the podcast was just after I had seen them perform in San Francisco, and the opening ceremony for this had the same First Nations people blessing the stage before the opening prayer. And it was so amazing. But I did want to play a little clip of In My Jan. And this is a part of the song that I haven't played on the podcast. It is part of the instrumental end and Maria's vocalizations. The thing I loved about this performance, and with each performance, the loops that are being created behind her vocals change from ritual to ritual. So I really loved hearing the Ranvahara, which is the bowed instrument, the way that was looped. It was absolutely beautiful. So here is a section of In My Jan. Love that. Couple of other things with the members of Heilung. Just a few weeks ago, the Midgardsblod Festival in Norway just happened, and several members of Heilung were there. Maria had a DJ set that she did in the Gildenhall, which was really cool to see some photos of. I had several friends that went there, and on social media got to see a lot of the photos and film footage of some of the performances. But also Songleiker performed, and they called it their world tour, the one and only time that they're going to be playing. They're going to be putting out some new music soon, which will include Ulva Time, which is currently not part of anything on streaming, but I have played that song previously on the podcast. So I'm not sure when the release date for the album is coming out, but I did want to play one of their other songs, which is on their album Gottfolk. And at the time of this recording, I'm not sure exactly which track I wanted to play. There are a few of them that are really beautiful and part of my spiritual playlists.
Läs hun både då sinna pipa Blanke då sin mässingpipa Färskjegynta som meg lika Läs hun både då sinna pipa La-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da La-di-da-di-da-di-o-dam La-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-dam
And thinking of other Heilung music, the Hellblade 2 soundtrack was finally released on streaming. A couple of things just released on streaming this week. The Gojira song from the Olympics was finally released as an official track, and I've already put that in the Music and Recovery playlist that I have for music played on the podcast. And I'll be having links for those playlists in the show notes for this episode as well. But the Hellblade 2 video game soundtrack includes the song Scythe, and I played their live performance that they did in December on an episode of the podcast, and now it's really awesome to hear the full studio version of it. But a lot of the other parts of the album are beautiful instrumental and ambient pieces. But yeah, both Maria and Kai were part of some of the songs on that soundtrack. Not the entire thing, but some really, really great music there. So I wanted to share that. Two other artists that I wanted to cover. One was Kati Ran, and she just released an album. One of the singles from it came out before the album was out, and I've been wanting to talk about it on the podcast. The song is called Kolga 16, and just recently I found an interview with Kati talking about the various inspiration for all of the tracks. The album that this comes from is called SAA, which means sea and soul.
Emotion is also a certain vibration, just like sound is vibration. And, in old Nordic culture, the idea about sound and the soul is also that it is connected. And so the breath is, for example, called the und and is an extension of your soul. And therefore, if we sing with our emotions and sort of vocalize our soul, then of course we can relate a little bit deeper to each other.
And a lot of the thematic elements of this album have to do with the goddess Ran and her 9 daughters, which are the various waves. And I've talked about this on, I believe it's episode 59, talking about meditation music and the song Blood Bilja, which involves the 9 daughters of Ran. It was really, really interesting to hear her interpretation of Norse mythology through this music. But again, for the song Kolga 16, I was there for the live premiere of this and got to experience part of the live chat. So here is Kati Ran with Kolga.
Saksa, I'm near ya.
such an incredible piece of music. So I had been looking for it and finally found something that was written about the meaning of the song Kolga. And it says, Kolga represents one of the coldest waves among the 9 billow maidens of the goddess Ran, capable of engulfing you in a chilling grip of icy water that can leave you breathless. With that in mind, the artist reminds us that what we often perceive as the most destructive forces of nature can also serve as a potent catalyst for change, offering newfound clarity. Kariran also dedicates the song to the many female figures that in one way or the other made significant sacrifices in their lives. And that was the list of names that she sings right before the chorus of Kolga. But yeah, I love the way this was described, that the most destructive forces of nature can serve as a potential catalyst for change. And definitely for me, the destructive force of my acting out behavior and hitting bottom were the catalyst that I needed to make change in my life by working the 12 steps of SAA. Anyway, great piece of music. And lastly, the artist Ivor just released a new album as well. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to play one of her new tracks or the song Falling Free. And Falling Free, I found this a year or two ago, and I don't think I've played it on the podcast yet, and is just amazing. So with this song, some people have interpreted it as a love song. I interpret it as a song of surrender. And the one catching me, quote unquote, is my higher power. And that's how I interpret this. So here it is, Ivor with Falling Free. This song just starts off so slow and quiet and just builds and builds with her amazing vocalizations. Oh, breathtaking. And the song winds down very nice and quiet, yet her voice goes up so high. Absolutely amazing. So I had found this video on YouTube, and I'll leave the link in the show notes if you're interested. It's a captivating performance. So in my spiritual journey over the past few years, Nordic folk and other aspects of that musical scene have been really a huge part of my expanding spirituality and recovery, with music being a higher power for me. And so, yeah, I did want to find a time on the podcast to be able to talk about some of those. And like I mentioned, I'll be talking about Vardruna on another episode. But yeah, so many of these artists have been releasing new material over the past few months. Another one that Maria Franz from Heilung was involved in, a metal song, and it was really cool to hear that aspect of her. I can play that on another episode as well. So with that, I'm going to close out this episode. If you wanted to leave feedback for the podcast, like the few emails that I read here, you can reach us at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. Or if you wanted to reach me personally, like Aimee did here, to be a guest on a future episode of the podcast, or if you had any other questions about the program, you can reach me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. I thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.